Deep in the Andes Mountains of Argentina, there lies a giant, a behemoth that absolutely dominates its surrounding landscape. Once a mighty volcano, what remains is still the highest point anywhere outside of Asia. One of the great seven summits, the mighty Aconcagua. This climb dates back to the very end of 2022. Filmed on my old iPhone 12, Aconcagua was and still remains my altitude high point. This is the story of how we rang in the new year on the highest mountain in all of South America. About to depart here in a couple hours to Mendoza, Argentina, where we're going to start our climb up Mount Aconcagua, the highest peak in both the Americas, actually, as well as the highest peak in the western and southern hemispheres. That's crazy, nearly 23,000 feet. It's going to be a monster of a trip and a monster of a climb. Those who have been following my journey probably know that one of my main goals here is to climb the seven summits, or the highest peak on each continent. Those including Aconcagua for South America, Kilimanjaro in Africa, Denali in North America, Carcinen's Pyramid in Oceania, Elbrus in Europe, Vincent in Antarctica, and eventually Everest in Asia. Of the seven, this one is ranked somewhere in the middle for difficulty, not for its technicality, but purely for its immense altitude and cold. At this point, I had already climbed Kilimanjaro and was now ready to step it up higher on the list. The very day after Christmas, I departed my home city of Orlando, Florida, one of the least mountainous regions in the US, and set off for South America for the first time, first connecting for a 19-hour layover in Panama and ultimately landing in Mendoza, Argentina. Being that I had never been higher than 20,000 feet at the time and would be traveling solo, this would be a guided trip with RMI Expeditions. The Hotel Diplomatic, which was included in the fee, was exquisite. After a quick meeting with the guides and the rest of the team, I had a free day to explore Mendoza, which instantly became one of my favorite cities I'd ever been to. This was Argentina about a week after winning the World Cup in 2022, so the love for its team and Lionel Messi was infectious at the time. Also, and I will bring this up many times during the video, the food. Holy shit, the food. Mendoza is known for several things, amongst them the most famous being Malbec and steak of all kinds, and we had plenty of both over the 3-week expedition. After the first night in Mendoza, I met up with the rest of the team, and then we checked to make sure that we had all the proper gear and food to last us over the next couple weeks. Afterwards, we all got together for our last dinner in civilization, and even made a few new four-legged friends. We then feasted on some steak and Malbec before departing deep into the Andes. The overall itinerary for our expedition would have us ascending the Polish Traverse route. We would hike for 3 days through the Vacas Valley, trekking through the new year in the process. Then acclimate for a couple days at Basecamp at 14,000 feet before strategizing our way up the next 3 camps to the summit at almost 23,000 feet. The valley is about as leisurely of a start as you can get. Also, fun fact, we actually trekked right past Alex Honnold and Esteban Mena in the valley later in the trip, as they were making a pit stop here on the way to Antarctica. What a wild life those guys live. Here's my bag. My expedition bag. We arrived at our initial camp, in which we enjoyed a nice dinner of, you guessed it, steak and Malbec. Literal heaven on earth. Up to this point, the trip felt more like glamping with occasional stretches of hiking in the flats, but all of that was soon to change in the upcoming days.
Basecamp, and then you're on your own.
I'll be one.
You may have heard of the Himalayan yaks in the Everest region. They help carry the many climbers' gear to base camp. Well, the Argentinian version of that is mules. Over 140 mules are generally used per season to transport gear and supplies from penitentes to base camp. And the next camp was where we would spend the New Year's Eve. We celebrated with a single beer each to welcome in 2023, before waking up on the first day of the year with a nice ice-cold river crossing.
Woo! You're so cool.
On January 1st, 2023, in a moment that I'll never forget, we all feasted our eyes on the highest mountain outside of Asia for the first time.
Ice glacial snowcap, and then the Polish glacier is coming off to the right. I can see our Camp 1 because I know what I'm looking at. It's going to be damn near impossible to point it out and have you know what I'm pointing at. But our Camp 1 sits, if I'm pointing with my arm, our Camp 1 is basically on that flat bench. Our Camp 2 is way out of sight, our Camp 3 is way out of sight. But yeah, this is nice. Lots of new snow up there. Good for us. Means more water.
After 3 days of trekking, we arrived at our base camp. From what I was told, Plaza Argentina is the second biggest base camp in the world, right behind Everest Base Camp. There were many climbing companies set up, some with extra entertainment such as guitars and foosball tables. And one of the porters even invited me out to go bouldering with him and some friends nearby. Had my unacclimated body not been exhausted from the day's exertion, I would have. Instead, I did some Wim Hof breathing in the yoga tent and ruminated on the days to come. Before going up the peak, it's here that every climber must go through a medical screening process to make sure that they are fit enough to continue. Aconcagua is sometimes referred to as the highest non-technical mountain in the world. On the main route, there is generally no use for ropes or axes, and not even crampons for most of the time. For this reason, it attracts many who see it as an easily accessible trek, something not much more than a Kilimanjaro. But honestly, that is not the case. Aconcagua is higher, windier, and colder. It reaches nearly as high as the peaks in the Himalayas. Also, while porters are available and eager to make some cash to assist climbers carry their gear, they are not required. One challenge that I took upon myself was to go with no porters for the entire trek. Not as a show of machismo, but I had already made plans to climb Denali about 6 months after this climb, and so wanted to prove to be able to be self-sufficient with the extra weight, which would be a necessity on that mountain. The way up to Camp 1 was ripe with spectacular views, with a sea of penitentes and some insane views of the Andes Mountains right on the horizon.
first heavy carry today up to Camp Uno. All its glory. It sucked. It really sucked.
After caching our gear for the next few days, we went back down to sleep low at Basecamp, a place I was growing too comfortable at to ever want to leave. No, seriously, I was debating even continuing to climb past this point. It was so nice here, whereas every step further up was a step closer to danger and isolation. After a couple rest days, we had yet another fill of steak and wine and listened to a senior porter give a rundown of his experience setting a record time on the mountain, as well as the effect of repeated Aconcagua summits on the body. We then hunkered down for the night in preparation to finally move up to our first camp the following morning. The next day, we ascended once again to Camp 1, and this time we were greeted by a nice caking of snow. This would begin to define the entirety of the next week on the mountain. Camp 1 was far less comfortable than Basecamp. No more Malbec and no more fancy meals. But I do have to give creativity points to the guides for whipping up their take on Cincinnati chili. Basically top ramen mixed with chopped up sausage. The landscapes gradually became more and more alien, but also more alluring. It was around this point that our group began to shrink as several clients got sent back down. Camp 1 sat at over 16,000 feet, and it's at this point that you're higher than anything in the lower 48, and your body starts to decide whether or not you can continue. In the same season as my climb, just a little bit later than our own journey, there would be 3 deaths on the mountain, all altitude and cold related. Aconcagua might have a reputation as an easy climb, but that does not mean that it's free of risk. So, what kind of name is Aconcagua anyway? The origin of the name Aconcagua is not universally agreed upon, but the most common one is that it's a translation from the indigenous Quincha language, which I may be saying wrong, meaning sentinel of stone. A fitting name considering just how gargantuan this peak is amongst its neighbors. The next couple days were spent waiting out the weather, posing for photos in the odd rock formations, and stacking rocks. Basically, just looking at or doing things with rocks. Life gets simpler in the mountains. It's both the appeal and the deterrent.
So today we're moving from Camp 1 to Camp 2. We lost a few of our comrades yesterday, 3 to be exact, which brings our group down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, including myself. We're at 16,000 feet right now at Camp 1. Camp 2 move up to about 18,000 feet, and we're moving, which means I'm carrying all my shit again, and today it's about 55 pounds. I forget how many miles, but it's a good little trek. Stoked to get up this thing.
Moving up to Camp 2 in the moment was pretty exciting, but little did we know at the time that we would be staying there for the next 5 nights. The odd weather patterns just kept rolling in, bringing in more snow and a lack of wind, which is uncharacteristic on this mountain. It meant deeper snowpack than usual. Some people were comparing it more to a Denali expedition than an Aconcagua one. It was maybe for this reason that by the time I would do Denali about 5 months later, I honestly felt overprepared. But in the moment, I was mostly worried about the onset of nausea and headaches that began to take me over. We were now sleeping at 18,000 feet. Plus, I was still carrying all of my own pack weight. So the exertion, plus the lack of oxygen, had me really struggling. As we ascended further up to Camp 2 and beyond, the weather kept getting harsher. I began to fantasize more and more about steak and wine back at the Plaza Argentina, but also grateful for these amazing views that not everyone gets. The morning after our first night at Camp 2, as everyone else was noshing their cereal and breakfast bars, I began to feel incredibly nauseated and a little dizzy. Before this trip, I had never really experienced true altitude sickness, and I believe that it finally hit me here. The days of constant exertion mixed with the fact that it was the highest I'd ever slept were catching up. I was able to walk it off and even managed to carry the same day to our final camp at over 19,000 feet. But the suffering would continue through the night as Cheyne-Stokes kept waking me up. Cheyne-Stokes respirations are often triggered at a high altitude and is characterized by faster or deeper breathing patterns followed by a decrease and a temporary stop. It can go on for several minutes and is absolutely terrifying. Also, if you search the word on Google, it is apparently also called end-of-life breathing. So that's fun.
Yeah. One of our first 2 rest days here at Camp 2. Or Tempo 3, depending on which route you take up this mountain. We made it up to high camp yesterday, doing a little carry / just acclimatization hike, which was cool because I reached my new high point as far as elevation, about 19,600 feet, which is about 300 feet higher than what Kilimanjaro was, and that was my previous high point. Downside, as you can see, that it was a very snowy and very sunny trek up. UV rays coming from all directions, so I am sunburnt in every weird orifice that exists. Like bottom of my nose, inside of my lips, the inside of my ears. So basically I'm not showing my face for the rest of the day. It's the clearest day we've had in a while. It's been just blizzard after blizzard after blizzard. Some of the guys are saying this is the snowiest ascent up Aconcagua they've ever had. And I believe it. It's been non-stop. It's been like Denali conditions up here. But yeah, so we're going to be hanging out here for today and most likely tomorrow. There have been some groups who have not made it due to so much snow. I mean, like waist-high snow, which at 20,000 and above feet is just unmanageable. So high hopes in that we are not dealing with that, and that these high winds that are coming through for the next couple days will solidify the snowpack and allow us to go over the top of it. Pretty uneventful day so far. Just listening to a lot of reggaeton, getting hyped, but not trying to get too hyped because we got a ways to go still, and a lot of sitting around to do for the next couple days. So yeah.
After a few admittedly miserable nights passed, more snow came, and then more wind. We even spent one day shifting around rocks like stonemasons, making chairs and tables out of them at camp, anything to keep busy while waiting for a window. And then finally, on the last possible day before our program would force us to turn back, that window arrived. Enough wind had come in to solidify the snowpack or blow the excess away, which would make the ascent much more doable with our lack of technical gear. After stashing half of our gear a few days prior, the trek up to high camp went much more smoothly the second time, and once reaching the top, I had reason to celebrate, as I had officially carried every bit of gear to the highest camp without the use of porters. For me, it was a pretty proud moment. As awesome as it was reaching the 19,000-foot final camp, it might have been the least comfortable camp I'd ever been to up to that point. The winds had a tendency to absolutely rip through it, and even threatened to take out our tents at one point. That, mixed with the absolutely terrible sleep at such a high altitude, and the promise of comfort, Malbec, and carne asada back at Basecamp, would not escape my mind. But first, we had to knock out the hardest day of the entire trip.
Aconcagua High Camp, 19,600 feet. Tomorrow's the day. We make our summit push of that. The Aconcagua summit, almost 23,000 feet. I'm already at the highest I've ever been, but that is a whole nother story. I believe we're getting a start around, I'd say 3 to 4 in the morning, maybe 5 at the latest. It's gonna be a 12-hour summit bid. Anything can happen, but with the weather being like how it was today, which has been virtually no wind, I'm beyond excited. I'm actually probably the most excited I've ever been.
At 5 a.m., we began our ascent up the highest point in South America. And very quickly, the cold began to affect everyone. Within minutes of stepping out of the sun and onto the Grand Traverse, I lost feeling in all my fingers and toes. One of our guides completely lost feeling in his right foot, and subsequently took down 2 more clients who also were having a very difficult time in the extreme cold. After the somewhat slippery Grand Traverse, we ascended the famed Candeleta, the crux of the climb. Around here, I started getting a little bit of brain fog and entered a slightly delusional state as a result of the rapid ascension. It was intense. Filming became difficult. And for this reason, I don't have nearly as much footage from that day as I aim to get. But on January 14th, 2023, at around 2:30 p.m., me and the remaining team summited Mount Aconcagua, the highest mountain in all of South America. We began the trek with 10 clients and 3 guides, and by the end, we were down to 4 clients and 2 guides. And yes, I got my naked summit photo. I'll be honest, it was hard to film Aconcagua. Being at this altitude left me exhausted all the time. This isn't just a long hike, this is mountain climbing, requiring all 4 limbs and more brain power, meaning it was hard for this amateur filmmaker. On this trip, I didn't get drone footage or a ton of time to set up decent shots, but what I did get was one of the most intense experiences of my life. On summit day, I experienced one of the physically hardest days of my life. I walked away from the Sentinel of Stone with new friendships, new perspectives, and a new continent high point. My second of the Big 7.